There is a reptile living in the canals just south of Miami that can outrun a grown man on dry land. In March of 2012, a wildlife patrol team found one. It was a warm night near Homestead, and they caught a pair of eyes reflecting back at them in the spotlight, low in the black water, the way an alligator's eyes sit. They moved the boat in to tag what they figured was an oversized nuisance gator. But the gap between those two eyes was wider than it should have been, which usually means a bigger skull than the local animals carry. And then, as the boat closed in, it did the one thing an alligator cannot do. It didn't roll, it didn't sink, it climbed out of the water, lifted its entire belly clear of the mud and sprinted into the sawgrass at roughly 14 kilometers an hour before anyone could get a pole on it. They wrote the whole thing up as a misidentification, a big gator seen wrong in the dark. 4 years later, a genetics lab at the University of Florida proved the mistake was theirs. The animal in that canal was not native to this continent. Its bloodline traced back 7,000 miles to a river system in Africa that kills an estimated 200 people every year. Everyone in Florida was watching the snakes. Nobody was watching the water. I'm Ambrose Wild, and this is the story of how the deadliest crocodile on Earth quietly moved into the suburbs of South Florida, bred there for 15 years, and left behind a question that still keeps biologists awake. To understand why this discovery landed like a bomb, you have to understand the strange, rigid peace that used to govern the Everglades. This is not a lawless swamp. For most of the last epoch, it has been carved up and enforced by two separate rulers, each locked to its own kind of water. In the freshwater sawgrass, the American alligator runs everything. It is dark, heavily plated, and everywhere, with a jaw evolved to crush turtle shell like a walnut. Out at the coast, where the ocean bleeds into the marsh and the water turns brackish, you find the other king, the American crocodile. And here is the part almost nobody outside the field knows. Despite the teeth and the prehistoric face, the American crocodile is close to harmless to people. It is a shy, fish-eating recluse. In the entire recorded history of the United States, there has never been a single confirmed human death caused by one. They are so fragile that their largest stable population survives clustered around the warm water discharge canals of the Turkey Point nuclear plant, using the reactor's waste heat as an artificial refuge. The system held because the borders were clean, gators in the fresh, crocs in the salt, and both of them, by African standards, remarkably restrained. Then, sometime in the mid-2000s, the borders started to slip. The change did not announce itself. It showed up first as an absence. Along Silver Bluff Creek and the connected canals near Coral Gables, the big resident American crocodiles, animals that had held the same basking banks for 20 years, simply stopped being there. They were not turning up dead. They were abandoning prime territory, which is something an apex predator almost never does. In the field, a dominant animal only walks away from good real estate for two reasons. The food collapsed, or something stronger arrived and evicted it. The food had not collapsed, so something had moved in. At the time, there was an easy suspect, and it was the wrong one. This was the peak of the python panic. Burmese pythons were erasing the mammals of the Everglades, wiping out the raccoons and possums and bobcats so thoroughly that researchers were driving 100-mile survey routes and counting almost nothing warm-blooded. Every strange report got folded into that story. So when locals along the canals started describing dark, aggressive reptiles that behaved wrong, biologists filed it under mistaken identity, assuming people were seeing dark-skinned gators or pythons in the water. It was a textbook case of a whole field seeing what it already expected to see. But the fishermen were stubborn, and their descriptions were specific in a way that should have been a warning. These animals, they said, did not laze on the bank like gators. They rode high in the water. They watched the boats. They tracked movement. And while every camera and every headline pointed at the snakes, a second invasion was setting up in the same water, using the python hysteria as perfect cover. The first hard evidence did not come from a sighting. It came from carcasses. Rangers started finding the remains of smaller reptiles that did not fit any pattern they knew. A python kills by constriction. It suffocates its prey and stops the heart through pressure. And it leaves the skeleton intact because crushing is not tearing. These bodies were not crushed. They were sheared apart with the rotational violence of a death roll. But the bite spread was too wide for an alligator, and the sheer aggression of it did not match the timid native croc. The working theory became a rogue gator with a temper. What the field did not yet grasp was that the animal doing this was not a known species behaving oddly. It was a different machine entirely, running on a faster metabolic setting, growing at a rate the local ecosystem had never had to account for. The break came in 2009, not in the swamp, but on a lab table. A field team pulled a juvenile crocodile out of the canal system near Miami. It was tiny, barely past hatchling size, but the herpetology team at the University of Florida knew within minutes that something was off. There is an idea from robotics called the uncanny valley, where a thing looks almost right, and the tiny wrongness is what makes your skin crawl. Biology has its own version, and this animal was sitting right in it. Under the trained eye of the museum's collection staff, the snout read correctly, the narrow V-shape that separates a crocodile from a blunt-nosed gator. But the armor was wrong. The back of a crocodile is set with bony plates called osteoderms, or scutes, and on a Native American crocodile, those plates are scattered and irregular, spaced out in a loose organic mess. On this specimen, they were laid out like tile, aligned, tight, geometric, almost no gaps between the rows. This was not a variation in pattern. It was a different blueprint for building a body. Then there was the behavior. And if the armor unsettled them, the temperament genuinely alarmed them. A Native American crocodile, when captured, thrashes once and then goes limp. It plays a kind of dead, shutting down to conserve energy, betting on stillness to survive. This hatchling did not stop. It came at its handlers with a sustained, almost self-destructive fury. And instead of the usual hiss, it produced a low-frequency growl, a sound that essentially does not occur in Florida waters. The team ran through the possibilities. A mutation, maybe, something twisted by runoff from the nuclear plant nearby. Or, more plausibly, a hybrid. Now, a crocodile and an alligator cannot interbreed. They split from a common ancestor around 80 million years ago, which is far too deep a gulf to cross. But two different crocodile species crossing is entirely possible. And that became the leading idea. that a Native American crocodile had bred with some Central American cousin and produced a mutt with a bad attitude. It was a reasonable theory. It was also completely wrong, and the data that would break it was still 2 years out. The team spent those 2 years watching the water and waiting for more animals. In 2012 and 2014, they got them, and these were not hatchlings anymore. They were sub-adults, and they were growing at a speed that broke the local rules. Here is why that number mattered so much. Crocodiles are ectothermic, which means their body temperature, and therefore their growth, is capped by the heat and the food around them. A Native American crocodile grows slowly and carefully, hoarding energy in a competitive world. These invaders were growing an estimated 28% faster than their native neighbors, and in the wild, a 28% head start is not a statistic. It is a death sentence for everything around you. It means you reach breeding age sooner. It means you hit maximum size sooner. And most of all, it means you can eat your competition before it ever grows big enough to eat you. There is a second, quieter reason these animals thrived that the original story glosses over, and it is worth pausing on. The Nile crocodile is one of the very few reptiles that guards its nest and defends its young for weeks after hatching, where the Native American crocodile mostly abandons the nest and lets the hatchlings fend for themselves. So the invader did not just grow faster, it protected more of its offspring to the age where they could grow faster too. In an empty niche, that combination compounds like interest. The 2012 capture, the one at Silver Bluff Creek, confirmed the worst of it. When you corner a Native American crocodile, it flees into the water. This animal did the opposite. It planted itself on the bank and rose up onto its legs in what is called a high walk, a posture that reptiles use to project total confidence. The body carried high and forward instead of dropped low in retreat. Everything lined up. The tiled armor, the short, broad snout, the low growl, the refusal to back down. But the lead scientist knew that morphology, the way an animal looks, was never going to be enough to declare an emergency. He needed the code. So the team cut small tissue samples from the tails of the captured animals, sealed them into vials, and shipped them off for sequencing. They were hunting one specific stretch of the mitochondrial DNA, a gene called cytochrome B. Think of it as a biological passport. It does not just tell you what an animal is, it tells you where its ancestors came from, sometimes down to the region. The team expected the passport to read Central America, maybe Cuba or Jamaica. When the sequencer finished its run in May of 2016, the coordinates it returned did not point anywhere in the Caribbean. They pointed to a river infamous for the deadliest routine encounters between humans and wildlife anywhere on the planet. The results went into the journal Herpetological Conservation and Biology, and they were unambiguous. The Florida animals were a 100% match for Crocodilus niloticus, the Nile crocodile. And that single word turned a biological curiosity into a genuine worst-case scenario, because of the gap between what the native croc is and what this thing is. The American crocodile is a specialist. It eats fish. The Nile crocodile is a generalist, and its generalism includes us. It is credited with an estimated 200 human deaths a year across its African range. And unlike almost any other large predator, it does not learn to avoid people. It reads anything that enters the water not as a threat to flee, but as biomass to process. But the geneticists found something sharper still, buried in the fine detail of the DNA. Nile crocodiles range across 26 African countries, and the Florida samples did not match the Nile populations of Egypt or Uganda or the Great Central Rivers. Their markers were a match for one specific southern lineage, the crocodiles of the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa. That was the fingerprint on the door. Crocodiles do not swim the Atlantic, and they certainly do not navigate from Durban to Miami on their own. The KwaZulu match confirmed the obvious dark truth. The vector was a human being. Somewhere in the late 1990s, a collector brought animals from that exact South African stock into Florida, almost certainly outside the law or on forged paperwork. And then, the way reckless exotic owners always do, once the cute 10-inch hatchlings turned into 6-foot predators, somebody opened a gate and let them go. Now, if you have been listening closely, you already have the piece of information that turns this from an invasion story into something worse. And I planted it a few minutes ago without flagging it. Hold on to it, because we are about to arrive at it. Identifying the species was only the first half of the horror. The second half was the calendar. Walk back through the captures. A hatchling in 2009, a subadult in 2012, another subadult in 2014. The genetics did not just name the species, it established relationship, and the analysis showed these animals were siblings. And siblings, as obvious as it sounds once you say it out loud, require parents. A breeding mother and father, alive and free somewhere in the canal system. To have produced a hatchling in 2009, that pair had to already be sexually mature, and a Nile crocodile takes something like 10 to 12 years to reach breeding age. Run the arithmetic backward, and patient zero, the founding pair, has likely been living in the Everglades since roughly 1998 to 2000. That is the piece I asked you to hold. For close to 15 years, two enormous African apex predators lived, hunted, and successfully reproduced inside the suburbs of one of the most populated corners of Florida. And not one person confirmed they were there. They rode out hurricanes. They survived cold snaps that should have killed a tropical species. They lived straight through the height of the python invasion. And here is the sentence that ends every version of this story the same way. We caught the children. We never found the parents. If you are still with me and this is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, because I go this deep on a new one of these every week. Now let me tell you why the missing parents are only the beginning of the problem. The immediate threat is the Nile crocodile itself, an aggressive man-eater loose in residential waterways. But the long-term nightmare is more insidious, and it has a name: heterosis, or hybrid vigor. The American crocodile and the Nile crocodile are separate species, but not so distant that they cannot interbreed. And in captivity, closely related crocodilians crossed to produce offspring that come out larger, stronger, and meaner than either parent. Right now, the one thing keeping the native American crocodile boxed into the bottom tip of Florida is temperature. It is a tropical animal. Push it much north of West Palm Beach and the winter cold snaps kill it. It is fenced in by the weather. The Nile crocodile does not have that fence. In Africa, it thrives from the equatorial heat down into the cooler, temperate waters of the southern Cape, which is exactly why the KwaZulu-Natal origin is so chilling. These are crocodiles adapted to a climate with a real winter. If the invaders breed with the natives, the hybrid could inherit the Nile's aggression and cold tolerance stacked on top of the Americans' local adaptations. That is not just a man-eater in Miami. That is a crocodile capable of pushing its range north into the canals of Fort Lauderdale, Boca Raton, and, over enough time, potentially as far as Orlando. The thermal wall that has always kept these animals penned in the south would come down. Evolution would have picked the lock. Since the 2016 confirmation, Florida wildlife authorities have run a shoot-on-sight policy for any Nile crocodile, with total eradication as the stated goal. And the honest, uncomfortable question is whether eradication is even possible. Consider the terrain. The Greater Everglades is more than 1.5 million acres of flooded sawgrass, mangrove tunnel and black water, one of the least accessible landscapes in North America. This is a place that swallowed an entire airliner. In 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 went down in the sawgrass, and the swamp took pieces of a 100-ton jet so completely that parts were simply never recovered. If a wide-body aircraft can vanish out there, hiding a family of crocodiles is effortless. The captured animals were removed, yes, but the mathematics of the situation is not comforting, because for every one an eradication team finds in terrain like that, the probability strongly favours others going unseen. And the founders, that pair from around the year 2000, were never located. They may have died of old age by now, which would be the merciful ending. Or they may still be out there, ancient and enormous, watching the airboats pass overhead, the way they have for a quarter century. For years we aimed all our fear at the snakes, and the pythons were a real disaster, no argument. But while the whole state was looking down at the grass, something else was sitting high in the water, looking up at the boats. The king of the Nile found a new kingdom, and in this one, we do not get to be the tourists. I'm Ambrose Wild. If the natural world hiding in plain sight is your kind of story, stay with me, because there is always another one waiting just under the surface, and I will be here to pull it out. I'll see you in the next one.